So, good morning everybody. Let's wait for those to sit down. So, today the lecture is about ground truth, building and augmenting datasets. What does that mean? First of all of you probably have some datasets, but in this lecture it's not about your datasets, but about other people's datasets, because you can use them, and they're very useful actually. So what we're going to do is to look at different types of datasets, famous datasets, also define what is a good dataset, and of course building your own. And also for the case that you don't have enough data, sometimes the machine learning techniques, they really require a lot of data, and you can't possibly get maybe the amount of data you really need. So that is about augmenting and how you can actually artificially increase the size of your data. Finally, as a quick glimpse into different machine learning techniques, I'm going to talk about baselines. And, well, that's the last part of the lecture today. So there is, of course, a bunch of good material that you can read. I hope the links here now are okay. I checked them earlier this week, so they should be okay now. There was one or two that was going the wrong way or not downloadable, so I hope everything is okay now. Those are actually not references, but it's more about software packages to do augmentation. So, I already cheated a little bit in the overview, but the motivation for this lecture is you really want to work with your own data, but and also learn about how to work with it and analyze it. But in principle, this lecture is not about that. So maybe a bit disappointing, but I hope you will learn something good anyway out of this. And the question you can start asking, why at all think about other people's data sets and why spend a lot of time of it? So let's see what other people say. So there's a couple of tweets here. Here's one guy. He is saying, in principle, he has produced a lot more information out of a few data sets. So actually he's going towards, you don't need so much, but you need good, really good data sets. That means they have good labels, they have good information, metadata around the conditions about the data. Data without additional information is useless. So, and the other thing is a screenshot from a lecture. In principle, what is saying that in a PhD project you have this much data and you spend this much time about getting the algorithms to work. Looking at what they do at AI department at Tesla, they have 3/4 of the time is spent on producing and making data the right way, and then the rest is algorithms. So that gives you an idea how important the data actually is and the quality of the data actually is out in large projects. And here's another one. Couple of tweets, but the important one is that this lady, Catherine Scott, she thinks about 95% of her time is about preparing and making good data. So that puts really the focus on make sure that you have the good data. If you don't have enough, then we come to the topic of this lecture, then you borrow from someone else, because there is a lot of data out there already. this has been talking a lot about data is the new oil in the modern age. There is an article which is linked here talking about it's actually not like oil, because oil is a limited resource. You need to transport it. You can't share it, because if you consume the oil in your car, the other guy can't use it. But if you, on the other hand, have data, you can share it. You can distribute it across the globe as much as you like, and as much people want to use it, of course. But data is very portable, and you can do whatever you want with it once you have it. So maybe the data was collected under some circumstances, useful for the scientists who collected it, but you can see a completely different use of it. An example is, right now I have a master student whose task is to segment roots in soil. And he started using data from retinal blood vessel scans, because they have about similar structures. So then he recycled that data and brought it into his task with good success. So you have to maybe be creative and to looking into the kind of structures and find it. But the important thing is the blood vessel data was already well labeled, and I will show you one slide of his data later. Yeah, as I said, data is reusable, so if you label up your data, and then we also come to the point about open data. Today in science, many funding agencies, they require nowadays open science, open publications, and open data. And open data is only good if you provide the information about the experiment conditions. Otherwise, if you just have a bunch of data, you could shuffle it around. Well, you have lots of bytes, but what do they actually mean? Can anyone use them? Possibly, but very hard. So always think about when you want to publish data on one open database like Zenodo, for example, then you also have to provide information, the experiment conditions, what brought you to this data. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. The other thing is, well, we also have the problem with algorithms. Students, PhD students, are very, say, goal-oriented. They want to solve the task. If you want to have some kind of possibility to reuse these results in the future, you have to put more time into making the code more structured, easier to understand, because, well, if I would look back to my old stuff, I don't even understand what I did or what I thought. I have changed that, because now I'm into software development projects where we really look into making the code more structured and understandable. But anyway, it's important to have a structure in what you're doing. And then some famous data sets that you can look at. One is MNIST digits. I'll show you an example of that soon. ImageNet. And under medical imaging, there is one called BRATS. And they are very important to set the foundation in training algorithms. So what is done a lot in machine learning today is that you start your training on some data which has similar features, and then on top you do the fine-tuning using your own data. And with that you can gain a lot of momentum with the existing data, and then make the advantages for your own work. So MNIST is a classic one about handwritten numbers. It's written or provided by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the USA. So So they have, I don't know how many, but digits written by several people, identified, and put a label on them. So in the database, this image is also associated with the label 9, and so on. ImageNet is a much larger one. It's a huge image database with different sizes of images, different categories, and it's organized in a hierarchical way on categories. So in the beginning, it was based on the same principle as WordNet, which is a large categorization of words. So you can see this tree structure, maybe not on this screen, but if you look closer on the slides, you can see that we have entity, then we have objects, and substance, matter, and then we split it out in a tree structure, and you can take every subtree that is relevant to you. In ImageNet, it's the same way. So, for example, you would have beings, then you can have animals and people, and then you split it down in more and more detailed categories. And ImageNet has been used to train classifiers, and there is even a competition in about how well you can classify the different categories that are in there. And this graph here shows the progress that in 2010 there was a failure rate of 28%, and then over the years it went down, and the whole thing was about how complex the machine learning algorithm was. And machine learning is usually divided into different layers where the information is propagated from one to the other, and by increasing the amount of layers, which cost a lot of computational power, you can get better and better precision in the predictions. So what they saw here is that when they started adding a lot of layers, then there was like a gap or a jump in the precision, and then went down, and with increasing layers they get better and better. And this one, which has a pretty good hit rate, had 152 layers. And there is also a link where I got this one. We can read on about the evolution of these competitions. And BRATS is about looking for tumors in brain MRI scans. And also here you have the original image, and then you have some labeling, and apparently you even have labeling in the different categories within this image, and these can then be used to recognize different malign regions within the brain. And often you have all these data. Sometimes it's small images, sometimes it's really huge ones. Example here is 100 megapixel, which, well, that's a pretty big one. But if you, for example, are into microscope and stitching together a lot of images, you may come up into these sizes. Every time when you start stitching a lot of data, then images grow. It can also be that the megapixel, now in the first assumption we are only talking about 2D, but if you go into 3D, then we are all of a sudden talking about gigavoxels easily. I mean, 1,000 by 1,000 by 1,000 is, well, maybe a large medical scanner data set, but if you go, for example, to the scientific scanners, 2,000 cubed is no problem. That's pretty normal, actually. And that's a lot of data, and storing this data is actually a different problem. In the history of doing segmentation, then it was a lot of handmade segmentation and labeling. And still, this part is needed because you need an expert to tell this region is something that I want to put my focus on, whatever that is. And it's very time consuming and very boring, to be honest. You don't want to do it too much, so that's kind of a balance. How much time do you have to spend on creating all these labeled data? But it's needed someone sits down and does it, because otherwise you can't provide the training material for the future algorithms. And with all this handcrafted information, nowadays there are even Russian teenage boys sitting, fine-tuning the machine learning algorithms and win Kaggle competitions, and also sometimes some prize money. And that's their kind of weekend job, to get the money, that they win these competitions. And they don't have a clue about the question at all, but they have algorithms that give the right answers with high precision. Well, that's a lot about having interest and drive to do it, but in the end it's based on the knowledge that the experts provided. So the question is, well, machine learning, deep learning, does it always win? Often it produces very good results, but it requires that you have the right information available. And the right information is, again, well-labeled data with good precision in the labels. I've seen, I was previously working at Varian Medical, and I could see how the doctors, they were marking out regions. Well, this is about the place where we have the tumor. Then the therapist said, does he see anything at all in that region? But they have to plan around it. But it's really the question about seeing the information and doing it exact. And that is the important thing about having this well labeled is important, because if you don't, then you might lose in precision and do the wrong decisions possibly. Well, so label structure. Structure is also important, because then you can categorize easier and access the data more easy when you do the training. And particularly if you have a lot of data. Then there are other ways to get data sets. One is going to Kaggle. It's a way of, it's a say dataset competition platform for machine learning. Also, Google has a separate search engine for datasets, where you can put in your search terms and you will find any dataset. So, for example, I also uploaded some tomographies. In this case, it was some kind of tutorial dataset, so about for reconstruction. So there are no labels. So it gets everything, and I found that dataset also when I did this Google dataset search. So that's a way also, if you don't find it in the traditional or classic databases, you can also go on these and get the information. So what does a good dataset? First of all, a lot of images. We're talking about statistical methods, so the more the better. Small datasets, of course, if you can't get more, are good for a starting point, but the more complicated your problem is, and also the more subtle the differences are. For example, seeing a tumor in lung tissue is not very easy, because the contrast differences are very small, so it's hard to differentiate it. Another problem where you need a lot of data is when you have class imbalance. I already mentioned class imbalance before, and in principle, whoops, that was the wrong one. Let's see. Oh, no, I got completely out. That's a way. So if you have a distribution, the majority of the data gives you a large Gaussian distribution, and then you have some data which is just a little bump down here. Even in logarithmic scale, it's a small bump. So it's hardly visible in the normal case. That is a very difficult case, and to handle it, you need a lot of data. Another thing is also you need a lot of diversity. So what does the real collection look like? Of course, it's easy to get a few samples, but you need the full variety of what the data can represent. There are also lots of other differences, like how you scan the data, also which reconstruction technique you used, how noise levels are very important to include in the training. Of course, you have probably a given noise range, but the more noise variations you can include in the model that you train, the more robust against noise the model becomes. Different illumination, rotation, colors. So you can add on to this list a lot of different diversity. And also you need a lot of many examples. It's, for example, male breast cancer is something that's hardly talked about because it's so rare, but it exists. And maybe if you have one data set, it's not very representative to make a learning algorithm around it. So it's the generalization is very hard in that case. Then, of course, you need meaningful labels. To start with, you need a good, clear task or a good question to set these labels. You can, of course, put labels on some data, but it's not helping you if it's not in the direction of what the task is of the learning. Should also be unambiguous, so they should be clear that this is that, and this is possibly the overlapping cases. They are very hard to include as labels, so you should avoid them. Also, have labels that can be derived from the data. The example here is that if someone can't afford the insurance, it doesn't really help the labeling because you can't see it on a CT scan that it's a poor guy. You don't see it. You only see the anatomical features and the malign parts, so that doesn't help you. So that's irrelevant information. Good is if you can make it quantitative, saying that this is something of area, this and that, or this has a strength, this and that. That's always good. And also labels about, they should also be non-obvious. So example here is that saying that the image is bright. Well, you can train an algorithm to check if something is bright or not bright, but you can get it as well from the histogram, or you can get it from the average value. So it's pretty useful, useless information in this case. Then the purpose of the data set also has to be defined. It actually goes back to the first question here, a clear task or question. So the purpose, what you want to do with the data, do you want to classify something, you want to do some regression on the data, segmentation, detect some change of some kind, or something else. That is important to define also when you define your data set. So looking at the classification is taking an image and put it into some category. Could be dogs and cats, or which kind of dog and which kind of cat, depends on how precise you want to be. And each image can only have one category. As soon as you have two categories for one image, then you start getting into the ambiguous cases. Then the algorithm can't tell where to put it, or it should put it in both, I don't know. They should also be, the categories should also be non-ordered, so there's no priority among them. So these are the things you can think about for the classification. Here's an example using the data from MNIST. So here we have the numbers again. What we want to do in this data set is to put them into categories. So we want to know that this is a 5, this is a 0, this is a 4, etc. And then we have the regression. Then we are about predicting something. It could be predicting water content in soil. Then you have a continuous value that you want to predict. Here there's also an example of value of house based on picture. Could also be not only the picture, but it could also be that you have a lot of other features that you add on to. Could be region, based on region and picture, and then you get the value out of this regression. And that's, I would say, that's a classic exercise task to do, because there is a huge database of American house prices and all the interesting information around them. Also telling from a hurricane if there is a risk that there will be a hurricane. I think I flipped it now. Anyway, and then you get a rating in some scale, maybe just a probability or level of severity of the hurricane based on the pictures, the satellite pictures. Another thing you can do is looking at different X-rays and tell the age of a child. So here is a lot of images of hands, and also the age of each child. This is a Kaggle competition, and if you want to look closer to it, then you can take a look at this link here. Segmentation is about looking at an image and look and identify different regions with some property that you want to follow. In my case right now, very actual is the root segmentation. So we have soil samples, tomographies of soil, and we want to see how the root is going through the soil. And with neutron images, that's not a trivial task. In some paper I even saw that it's classified as the highest, the most complicated task in soil sample imaging. So for that we use then machine learning techniques to find the roots. Every pixel in the end will need a label. So in the training data you have to have a matching image with what you would expect it to be. And then of course the output will be then that the roots are labeled. Often it's limited to a few number of objects or types of objects. In this case it's mentioned 20. It's already pretty many, but anyway, so again, two examples here are if there is a tumor in the image of a lung, or if there is streets on a satellite image of a neighborhood. That would also be a segmentation. Another one would be to identify cars on the street. And here is one example of segmentation where we want to look at nuclei on the microscope image, and afterwards you want to have labels on each one of them. This is maybe a more classic image processing task than machine learning, but in some cases it's also good to have use machine learning here. Could be different types of nuclei here. Some have a certain property and you want to identify which property each nuclei has. Well, cells and nuclei is not my thing actually, so I can't really tell what are the priorities there. But anyway, that is something you can look at within these images. Detection is taking an image and see what can we, what changes do we see within them. Detecting some features. It could be, I will soon show you an example of lungs where different regions are detected. Could also be from a radar images, detect this is an aircraft, please follow it and track it. And also multiple objects, so if two planes are going across each other, you can also separate them from each other. So here is a case of the lungs, where we look at the lung opacity, and from that making some conclusions. Well, there are of course a lot of further possibilities on what you can do, so you can follow these links and check. Another one where you can also use the dataset is image enhancement and use for denoising. This links to a paper which looks at essentially dark images, but still can get out relevant information out of it. With image enhancement, the filters will be very tuned to the type of images that you look at or train it for, and in our case it will most likely not perform as well as you would like to. Super resolution requires several images that you combine, and with that you can actually boost the information, because with these several images which are a little bit displaced, you can then super sample between the pixels, because each pixel sees a little phase shift in the data, and that can be used to obtain the super resolution. Now, building your own data set, well, that's a task that takes a lot of time, and to be honest, there are not so many great tools to do it. So there are a couple of tools that you can find on GitHub. Some tools you can also buy. Some can be pretty expensive, and also labeling and data preparation is often also problem specific. So it's hard to have a generalized tool. This is the tool that you can do all data preparations on. So you probably have to look for your own tool suite based on some, call it building blocks, to build your data set. Different ways. There are some free tools to or code-free alternatives. So one is actually just organize your images into different folders. These are cats, these are dogs, these are whatever, birds. That is one way of doing a very rough categorization. The other one is to create an Excel file, just a table saying file name has this feature, file name has this feature, or is corresponding to this value. What you also can do is going in using an image processing tool like Fiji, and mark regions with a mouse and identify them, and then you will get a second image that have all the labels in them. Then there is here a list of tools. Some are, actually, to be honest, I didn't try all of them, but some they are a bit tricky. Some are even semi-free. So, for example, the label box, you can do it by compiling and using the code that is on GitHub, but you can also do it as a service that you pay for, and then you have probably some extra features within that service. Then there are also a couple of commercial approaches which you can look at. So there is a lot of alternatives, but you have to look for or select the one that it makes sense for your data. So it is you have to do a survey of what you really need in order to get the data, get this labeling. Another way which is useful is, now we actually come in towards augmentation, is doing simulation. Some cases you can actually simulate the behavior that you expect to look at, and with that you really have a good ground truth to start with. I think I mentioned already in one previous lecture about a case where they had aluminum blocks with some defects in them, and they created essentially a synthetic aluminum block, which then did the whole chain of first making forward projection, adding a lot of physics around how the X-rays go through the sample, and then they did a CT reconstruction, and afterwards they started doing the classification or segmentation on these. Actually, it was both. It was in one case it was just saying this one has, and this one, and in the other one they had really identifying this is a sensitive region, that is sensitive region, and in this case they had the whole ground truth because they know where they introduced all the faults. In this simulation chain, they could also try out with different resolution. They could try with different noise levels. I think also different levels of beam hardening in order to see how robust these algorithms are. And in the end, it actually ended up in a commercial product. So Volume Graphics has this now as a part of their fault detection module. And that's actually this paper I'm citing here. So if you want to look closer to that, then you can have it. Then we have problems with our data sets. So, I already mentioned the imbalance, which comes back all the time. You may have too few samples. The samples may not be homogeneous, so you don't really have so representative collection for all cases. And there may also be other problems like artifacts, etc., which make life even harder. So that gives you also the headache when you start implementing algorithms. You have to really take care of handling these cases. And yeah, this is a nice example. Not being a racist also, but anyway, Google had some classification of a lot of pictures, and they saw there were skyscrapers, there were airplanes, cars, bikes, gorillas, and graduation. Those people here were classified as gorillas for some reason. So the training algorithm didn't really recognize them, and that was a problem because probably they had too many gorillas in the database, and that all of a sudden under these conditions made this label. So someone got pretty upset, and Google took the algorithm down, of course, and the first solution was actually just to remove gorilla category completely. So the database for some time didn't find gorillas. So the solution, instead of just taking out the category, which kind of is a quick panic solution, which solves the problem for a little while, is actually adding more and more data, more categories, more detailed categories, in order to make a better prediction of what you have. So there is also the IBM face data set, which has a lot of categories, and I would probably say that they have more categories for each picture, but these are some examples at least of different categories that they have. So if you go on Google, you can even take a picture and say I want pictures similar to this one, and Google actually finds pretty good results. You probably have tried it already, so probably nothing new to you. So here comes a little example, and now we load some data, so it's the numbers again. And now I need to switch that one off. Yep. And loading the data, we have now a collection of 1, 2, 3 in a data set. Unfortunately, right now, the histogram doesn't want to show, so I need to show it like this. Now it's better. Good. So you can see here that there is a distribution among the 1s, 2s, and 3s, where the 1s are dominant, and that gives you the distribution of the data, so it's relatively homogeneous distribution in this case, even though there is one majority class. And actually, with that, I would like to make a break, because now I go into the augmentation case. So, well, let's see you after the break.